Hello and welcome everyone to the 24th webinar in Contact's Produce Safety webinar series and our season 3 finale. This webinar series tackles fresh produce safety topics that bring together industry, academia, and regulatory minds to solve some of the produce industry's most timely challenges. And today, being our season finale, we have all three of those groups represented today. This series is part of a larger industry outreach and risk mitigation project called Contact, or Scientific Challenges and Cost-Effective Management of Risks associated with implementation of produce safety regulations. This project is supported by the Specialty Crops Research Initiative from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. As such, any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Contact is a large grant initiative, and it represents several different universities and government institutions that make up our Contact team. It's comprised of over 50 faculty, staff, students, and volunteers, not to mention the support of our Produce Advisory Committee, or PAC. It takes a village, and we appreciate each individual's support and ongoing efforts to make Contact a grant championed by you all, especially all of your eval and feedback as well on this webinar series. Greatly appreciated. Be sure to check out the Contact website and YouTube page for more produce safety resources beyond just the webinar series, though that is where you can find all of the recordings. On our website, you can find information about each of our research objectives and starting new results, as well as key takeaway documents and much, much more on some of our upcoming training programs. Subscribe to our page and get instant notifications of content as well. This season, we've made the switch to constant contact. While this doesn't mean that you won't get emails from me at times with webinar recordings, it does mean that we've leveled up a way to stay in touch with you all and #make contact. So anyone can sign up for our new mailing list on our website, as well as I will include this link in the webinar recording for those of you who've signed up today. If you want to look for our website, you can Google Contact Produce Safety Research, and it's housed by the University of Florida. So why we're all here today, we skipped some of our research updates because I really want us to get into all things agricultural water. We have our experts on tap. So you can see our very cute irrigation system is supposed to model experts on tap. But a quick reminder for today, if you would like to submit a question for our speakers during or before the Q&A session, you can please submit your questions at any time in the Q&A box. We also have a wonderful slate of speakers and panelists. I'm not going to read all of their wonderful bios, but they are all excellent and fabulous individuals. I will just give a really brief introduction of who they are, and when I send out the webinar recording, I will make sure that I have a link to each of their bios so you can read more about them or make contact with them. Like I said, we have 3 quick presentations, and then we're going to get in introducing our panel and playing our first ever game of sort of name that biggest hazard and risk with agricultural water. But let's get started with our speaker slate. We've got Kruti Ravaliya, and she is a consumer safety officer with the Division of Produce Safety within CFSAN at the Food and Drug Administration. She'll be our first speaker. Then we transition into Dr. Betsy Bihn, who is the director of the Produce Safety Alliance at Cornell Agritech. Then we finish up with Dr. Channah Rock, who is a professor and extension specialist at the University of Arizona. And then we meet our fabulous panel. We also have Coreen Anderson, who's the director of food safety and compliance at Wyckoff Farms based in Washington State. Natalie Dyenson, who's the chief regulatory and food safety officer for the International Fresh Produce Association. And Sarah Cope, who is the produce safety program outreach coordinator at the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. I will let Kruti take us over, and we will start all things ag water.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here today. I just want to turn my camera on real quick to say hi, or to say a quick hi. And I'm going to turn my camera off now and get my slides up on the screen. Thanks everybody again for the opportunity to present to you this afternoon on the ag water final rule requirement. We're not going to do as deep of a dive into the requirements as we've done in previous presentations. I'm just going to go over the material at a super high level. We'll go through the decision tree diagram that I'm sure many of you have seen. And then we'll touch upon some of the resources that we have for supporting materials that were published in conjunction with the final rule. Now, questions whether or not the slide will advance. We have the second slide up there, overview of the final rule.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. So at a high level, this rule takes into account feedback that we received from a variety of stakeholders throughout the rulemaking process. And that includes feedback from stakeholders that we received directly to the docket. It includes feedback that we received from stakeholders even before the rule proposal that we published in 2021. It also takes into account emerging science, as well as information that we have captured and synthesized from recent produce-related outbreaks. So this package that was finalized in May requires a high-level systems-based assessment to be conducted at least once a year, and that evaluates the various factors that we've seen throughout the evaluation or throughout the evolution of the ag water requirements that have played critical roles in establishing safety through the use of ag water. And so those factors that growers are required to evaluate include details around the ag water system. So that would include both the source and the distribution system and any potential type of conveyance in between. It also takes into account how the water is being used. So understanding and knowing the differences between the various types of on-farm uses and capturing that. I'm not saying I only use it for this irrigation purpose, but then not necessarily including any kind of protection sprays or anything like that. It also takes into account crop characteristics. I'm so sorry, my sons are home. I'm so sorry. Takes into account crop characteristics and the different types of crops that are being grown, whether or not there's information available out there that can identify or at least help establish some type of risk framework. I'm so sorry. That can help establish whether or not there's an additional risk that may be associated with the way that the crop that's being grown is grown. Taking into account if the crop is being grown on the ground directly or whether it's being trellised, that kind of information. And then whether or not there's any environmental factors that may be necessary to evaluate. Is there a likelihood of heavy flooding, or does flooding happen very rarely? What does heavy rain look like in your region? Are there opportunities for UV exposure? And then lastly, whether or not there's any additional information that hasn't been captured by those other categories. So this would be the category where water quality testing would fit in. And so if a grower is conducting water quality testing, that information will be captured under this other factor. The assessment is also required to be conducted in a timely fashion and make determinations in a timely fashion based on the information that's captured. So if you identify hazards during this assessment, based on the type of hazards that you identify, if it's a certain category of hazards related to adjacent and nearby land uses, you're required to take a more expedited action rather than if you were to identify hazards that were not related to adjacent and nearby land uses. This assessment, again, as I mentioned, also takes into account new science that demonstrated the limitations of the previous testing requirements and findings from several produce-related outbreaks. This assessment did not, or the requirements, the regulation that was published in May, do not make any changes for sprouts or harvested, water that's used in harvest and post-harvest setting. Excuse me. So many of you have seen this slide before. We'll walk through it really quickly or maybe slowly. So the top blue box is where you're capturing all the information from your assessment. So all of the information around the nature of your water source and system, kind of crop you're growing, how the water is being applied, environmental conditions, other relevant factors, anything that would help you make a decision based on your specific situation. You would then take that information and make a determination as to whether or not your water is safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. If you determine that your water is not safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, then you would take the first right side of the red box where you would say immediately discontinue use of that water and implement a corrective measure before resuming use. Instead, if you determine that your water is not safe or not of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, and I apologize for the double negative, it relates back to Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the regulatory framing of these requirements. So you would, in effect, determine that your water is safe and is of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. You would then go on to determine whether or not you have hazards that are associated with your operation. And so you would then make the determination if there are hazards, if they are associated with adjacent and nearby land uses, specifically related to animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, or the presence of improperly treated or partially treated human waste. So if you identify hazards through this assessment that are related to adjacent and nearby land uses, specifically with those three categories, then you would implement a mitigation measure promptly and no later than the same growing season. So that's that expedited timeframe that I mentioned on the previous slide. Instead, if you determine that there are hazards, but they are not related to adjacent and nearby land uses, there are other conditions on farm that are that may present known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, but they are not related to the adjacent and nearby land uses that I described above, then you either can implement a mitigation measure as soon as practicable, but no later than the following year, or if you don't implement the mitigation measure, then you must conduct water quality testing to further inform that assessment. So if you implement a mitigation measure as soon as practicable and no later than the following year, you must ensure that the water then becomes appropriate for its use and that your mitigation measure was effective. If you decide instead to conduct water quality testing to further inform that assessment, and again, considering whether or not as long as there is no public health risk to delaying the implementation of a mitigation measure, you can conduct water quality testing, and then you would go back up to the blue box at the top of the screen and you would flow through that decision tree once again. Once you get to a point where you've determined that you're managing the hazards or that there are no hazards present, you would continue regular inspections and maintenance of your ag water system at least once annually, or if a reassessment was necessary. I'm not going to get into reassessment today just because there's not enough time. But so that's a high level, those are the ag water rule requirements. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance, there's a lot more detail, and I'm sure we're going to get into some of those details in the Q&A and the panel conversation. Compliance dates this quickly for the largest of farms will be April 7, 2025, small farms April 6, 2026, and very small farms April 5, 2027. FDA, as in previous rulemakings, has committed to taking an educate before and while we regulate approach as we support compliance. And we anticipate working hand in hand with all the stakeholders that we'll need to work with in order to ensure compliance. There are some fact sheets that are available to go into more detail on FDA's thinking on certain topics. And so you can find those on the FDA website. We've also updated the Ag Water Assessment Builder to reflect final rule requirements. And there's additional guidance as you walk through the steps of the Ag Water Builder. So if you'll notice when you're in the builder, there are certain spaces where there's a little blue eye and you can hover over that. That's more information, additional thinking around the topic that's on the screen. And so it's definitely not just a yes or no sort of decision tree. There's a lot more meat to walking through that we've put some thought into. And then there's a few other resources. Of course, you can always submit a question to the TAN. You can reach out to your Regional Produce Safety Network representative. And you can also reach out to the Ag Water and FPA.HHS.gov inbox. And I think, Laura, would you mind pulling that out and putting it in the chat so that people can refer back to it?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then that's it for me today for the presentation, at least.
Fantastic. Betsy, you are up to tell us all about the science.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to see everyone. Get my video on, so just give me a second. What's the science telling us? We're going to do a quick 12 minutes of summary, and I want to start out with a few key things that I think we all have to keep in mind when we're thinking about the science. First of all, there's decades of science. There's lots of research, and our understanding is going to continue to evolve, and the regulation allows this, and that's the important part. So new stuff that comes along, we're going to be able to use. That's a key point. And all research is not relevant to this discussion. Just because the research proves it can happen, it does not mean it is reasonably likely to happen in a farm environment. So it's important to look at the research and say, is this relevant to me? It's also important to look at the research and say, is it valid, or is it valid for my situation? And I'm going to give you a couple examples of that as we move through. Here's one example. This is a research done by a group of folks. Michelle Danilick was the one who suggested I use this one, talking about the dispersal of salmonella by rain splash on tomato plants. And you can see here in the red box, it talks about what was the result of the research, right? So they delivered rain in the duration of 0 to 10 minutes. The dispersal was reduced when the duration increased from 10 to 30 minutes. So there was this window where at 10 minutes, it seemed to be the primary distribution of the salmonella, right? You can see that last sentence there. Important things to consider about this when you read it more. First of all, this research was done in a greenhouse with simulated rain, and it was delivered at about 2.36 inches to 4.33 inches per hour. That's a lot of water. If you're in an area where you don't have that kind of water, if you're not using this kind of mulch. So I want to highlight this as being able to read the research that's available and ask, is this relevant to my operation? And is the research valid for what I'm trying to make decisions about? The other thing that's important to consider is that we're asking growers to gain access to the research, read it, understand it, and make decisions based on it. First of all, not all research is accessible. And what I mean by that is you can't actually get to the research articles because you have to pay a subscription. Those of us that are at universities or involved in industry groups, they pay that fee. Some of this is changing as we move to open access. I had a colleague review these slides, and they asked if I meant accessible by understanding all of the techniques that are used in research. And I think that's also something worth mentioning. Not all growers have the necessary background to know what is relevant and good. And not all technical support people do either, or inspectors, or regulatory people. And that's important to understand when we think about how this rule is rolled out, how it's implemented, how it's inspected, and what that looks like. How are those conversations going to happen? There are not enough people to provide technical support to growers, regulators, and others making these decisions. And you can look at this a couple of ways. One, I just think from the factual standpoint, there isn't enough technical support for the growers that are going to need the help. Two, there does open up an opportunity for us to work on tools and resources to help stretch the reach of technical support. And I know industry groups and I know growers, our extension educators are all working on that. But it is important to acknowledge that there isn't a lot of technical support for the number of farmers we have who are trying to implement food safety practices. If you ask 3 experts to make an ag water assessment determination on the farm, you may get 5 answers. And what's important about this, we're going to see it later with the game that Laura mentioned we're going to play later. But what's important is the research doesn't always agree either, right? So sometimes you see correlation between E. coli and pathogens, sometimes not. And so it's important to consider that, again, the research sometimes is variable. Food safety is not the only important decision growers are making during crop production, packing, and transport. I think sometimes when we work in food safety, we think it's very important and we get our tunnel vision goggles on. That is not the way growers are working in this environment. They have to worry about pest management, water, weather, market prices, and that's important to remember when we're talking with farmers. This is a quote I pulled from a Gill paper. There is no unique preventative measure or intervention strategy that could be applied at one point of the food chain. And I highlight this to say there is not one thing that can fix all the risks that are out there or reduce all the risks that are out there. And so we really have to take a holistic approach. And part of that holistic approach becomes looking at ag water systems inspection, which is part of the new requirements. It applies to both pre-harvest and post-harvest water. It lists a couple of areas you need to look at: location and nature of your water source. Research certainly tells us that different water sources have different levels of risk. Obviously, open water sources are higher risk than, say, municipalities. But as we know, municipalities sometimes have issues, and you get boil water recommendations and other things. So it's never risk-free out there. The type of water distribution system. Open distribution systems are definitely higher risk than closed, but every system needs to be assessed for the risks it poses. The degree of protection of the water sources from contamination. This is important when we look at different literature that tells us what we can learn about well construction to prevent, say, contamination of groundwater. But that isn't always foolproof, because oftentimes it depends on what's happening in the aquifer overall. And as we know, we're having issues with aquifers nationally. And there's many sources of contamination of water through, even with protection. So again, those considerations. The important part is that these things are going to influence the agricultural water assessment that I'm going to talk about now, and the research that supports that. This is up here really just to highlight that an water assessment includes that agricultural water systems inspection, the ag water practices, crop characteristics, environmental conditions, and other relevant factors. It's also important to recognize that reasonably likely point, which is that, are these conditions reasonably likely to introduce known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, and determine the measures that are reasonably necessary to reduce them. Okay, so again, you have to look at the context of that assessment. Starting with ag water use practices, human pathogens, the literature tells us, can survive, be distributed, and contaminate produce through water. Okay, and there's lots of ag water practices on the farm: irrigation, cooling, frost protection. All of these things use water. We do know that extending the time between the application of water and the harvest of produce reduces risk. That changes depending on where you're at, but that time expanded will reduce your risk. Modifying your practices to reduce contact of the water on the produce will also reduce your risk. But there are always issues that can creep up even if you have drip systems. And there's lots of publications like the one I have highlighted here to help understand these situations related to water use. Crop characteristics. Research on crop characteristics does not encompass every crop that is grown in the U.S. And I would like to highlight that the Ag Water Assessment Builder that Kruti mentioned gives you 99 crops, but it's a lumber. Lots of crops. There's one entry for citrus, despite the fact that there's multiple kinds of citrus. So there's a lot of commodities that are being produced, and there just isn't the science to support being able to tell what is best for your particular crop. There is research that looks at where the crop grows. Does it grow near the ground? Is it staked on a tree? How do the risks change? What's the texture of the produce you're growing? What's the construction of the epidermal layer? Is it sensitive to being bruised or punctured? And the shape even of the commodity. And even the growth stage of the crop can impact internalization depending on where it's at. So all of these factors have been looked at in the literature. Some commodities, you will find, have a fairly decent amount of research. And so there's a lot to look at. And many extension guides or industry guides are there to help growers. But that is for a very small number of commodities when you look at the breadth of commodities that are grown across the U.S., or the diversity, I should say. Environmental conditions. Differing environmental conditions can have a significant impact on the pathogen presence and survival. What the literature tells us is different areas have different impacts. Okay, so solar radiation, we know, will decrease survivorship of human pathogens in water and on the crop, but it's variable depending on how much solar radiation you get. Lower relative humidity is associated with faster microbial die-off. Again, it's drier, harder for the organisms to survive. Rain events typically contribute to contamination of running surface water sources, right? So if you get rainfall and you get runoff from the land around into the running water source, you will start to see fecal indicators go up, turbidity go up, other indicators go up. Flooding rain events are almost universally bad news. I would say I have not read a publication where a flood event resulted in anything good for food safety. Okay. And then climate change. This is the one I think about a lot. Climate change is likely to impact how growers assess risk because the areas are seeing unusual weather patterns. So even if you're in an area where there has been research done in your area, that may not be relevant anymore because the patterns are changing. This particular paper, which I really like, I want to highlight 3 things here. First, if you read the box that's here, you will see that there's differences based on areas. What they saw in Arizona did not always line up with what they saw in New York. They learned things from the different sampling strategies they use, which was very interesting. These are sampling strategies we don't typically see being used on farms. And the last thing is, despite this being a very interesting and impactful publication, are we confident the growers will understand the methods that are used, have time to assess the methods, and understand what they should be learning from this? Other factors that should be discussed are things like testing. Testing is one way to know if there's fecal contamination of your water source. The issue, though, is that fecal contamination is not always associated with pathogen. It's also true to say if you have fecal contamination, it doesn't necessarily mean you have pathogens or don't have pathogens, right? It's an indication of fecal contamination. Testing is a good way, though, to know if you're having a contamination event related to pathogens. If you're near an animal operation, if you yourself have animals on your farm along with your produce. The larger the volume of water you test, the more likely you are to find what you're looking for. Very common in research to increase the volume of, say, water you're sampling. But it's not that common on farms to start collecting liters and liters of water. And it's important to understand that the tools of research are not the tools of the farm. Testing is valuable, even if not required by the regulation. I think that's important. The other thing you should think about when you think about other issues is adjacent land and animal. I love these 2 publications that are relatively old, but one of them talks about sheep on a pastured kind of land versus cattle on a dust kind of land, and the different risks that those impart to the crops that are near them. And it's just to highlight again, it's not always, it does matter what is on the adjacent land. It does matter what kind of animals and what kind of pasture they're on. So a lot of different attributes that will change the risk. So in summary, research is available to help guide decision making. Research is very specific to location, commodity, pathogen, environment, and growers need to understand what's relevant to their farm. And some growers need to understand there's not going to be research that is relevant to what they're doing. Research uses tools and methods that could be very uncommon or expensive, so they're not really accessible to growers. So even if they want to use it, they might not have access to it. And the growers are going to have to make some assumptions while making decisions about water use and pre-harvest water management when there isn't science to back them up.
Thank you, Betsy. Channah, it's all yours.
Awesome. All right. Hi, guys. I was excited to actually talk about what we're actually going to do after those exciting and positive comments from Betsy and also from Kruti. No, all jokes aside, I think that we're excited about the next phase of the rule and seeing this rolled out and wanting to come to you guys with some practical information that could potentially help everybody really put this into practice, right? How are we going to translate this into reality? So first off, what does the rule actually say? You've heard this again from Kruti, you've heard it from Betsy, you've probably heard it if you've seen any of the other webinars related to this, and then also if you've read it, right? You've got to conduct an assessment at the beginning of the growing season as appropriate, but at least once annually. It's got to be a written assessment as well. I think that needs to be driven home for these different audiences. As Kruti said in that flow chart, there's some double negatives in there, and that drives a bit of folks a little nuts. And not safe means that your water's okay, that you move through that assessment and you move on to that next stage. So remember that. Another thing, just a bit to clarify, because we get a lot of questions related to this, is about water testing. And so certainly within the current language, water testing can be used in conjunction with, right, an assessment, but it's really up to the grower to determine what criteria is appropriate. So if you're testing, it must be generic E. coli or other valid indicator organism. Your frequency and that criteria, again, must be appropriate based on the use of the water. So what we've been telling industry is just be prepared to justify any of those actions, either with literature, as Betsy said, recommendations from SMEs, or your own historical knowledge or own historical testing that you've done in the past. But potentially be prepared that there's going to be some discussion with either FDA or the state inspector, whatever that might look like. So just being prepared. When we're talking to growers, right, in the real world, an ag water assessment is likely going to be conducted as a pre-season activity. And so hopefully that kind of remains in step and in line with what we've seen. And then again, just to reiterate, it's got to be written, reviewed, dated, and signed in a reasonable time by a supervisor or a responsible party. So I think that's a big one that we see from time to time, is that folks do a really good job of conducting assessments, but they don't put it in front of someone else to review and to verify. And so really make sure that you're doing that. Another big thing is that now, obviously doing this once a year, potentially doing this pre-season, but also in the event of a significant change. And again, being ready and prepared to identify what we deem as significant. So that whether that's an environmental condition like flooding, change in weather patterns, but also thinking about the change in the water use or the water source, that reassessment must be conducted. And I would say a full assessment. And then again, making sure that you can justify what was or wasn't deemed significant, and having someone else be able to verify that through that written determination. You said before, and as Kruti mentioned, there are exemptions, whether you're using a public water system with that certificate of compliance, potentially if you're treating the water in accordance to the rule, or if you have some testing that meets those microbial standards, as long as you're still doing that assessment. But what I would argue is that in each of these scenarios, regardless if you have an exemption, it's probably going to be helpful and smart to do an ag water assessment anyway. It's going to help you do things better. It's going to help you better understand and assess your water sources, your system, your distribution system, those uses, and the potential areas that are in your control or out of your control, and how to do this better, how to be aware of potential hazards, and how to identify how to mitigate them moving forward. So just something to think about. Even though those are the exemptions available, it might be wise just to conduct one anyway, just so that you're comfortable with that. We talk a lot about treatment with the contact group, and certainly you've seen Laura, Michelle, myself, they come to you all and talk about agricultural water treatment historically, as we all have heard, right? There's the revised label language from human health pathogens, the requirement of a 3-log reduction. We're still waiting for some of these chemistries to have their final label language approved by EPA. So what do we do in the meantime for a lot of folks who are already conducting water treatment? So I would say if you're conducting water treatment according to the label, if your water testing results post-treatment or non-detect or low generic E. coli or other relevant indicator organisms, potentially if you're meeting those STV and geometric means that were previously established by FDA, you potentially could justify your actions for treatment and that you're moving in an appropriate way. Now, that kind of remains to be seen how FDA and other auditors are going to be able to evaluate these treatment systems when we don't have label language currently. But regardless, water testing post-treatment is a way that can help verify that your treatment is working as appropriate. And so certainly something that we always recommend in folks to support their actions specifically with treatment. Beyond some of that, what could an ag water assessment include? And we've heard different tools that are available. I'll highlight some of those, but also related to documentation. Here's some things and just things we pulled together so you can have a map or orientation of your field, obviously identifying your water sources, your turnouts, the direction of flow, and how water is being used. Potentially, if there's different ownership in adjacent land, what that might look like. Sometimes what we've also seen with folks that they have their timing scheduling or their irrigation scheduling also as a piece of documentation. And then also documenting those adjacent land use practices. So do you have animals on adjacent land? Do you have residential areas? Do you have compost operations? Do you have a staging location. So really take a step back, have a high level overview of some of your farms or ranches and identifying where water moves and potentially what could influence that quality as it's moving on to your farm or ranch. As Betsy said, crop characteristics is going to be extremely subjective. So not all surfaces are created equal. So thinking about if they're rough or they're smooth, do potentially those surfaces allow for pathogens to retain or to hide? We've heard the bowl shape of romaine over and over again. But I think from what we've seen in the literature or lack of what we've seen in the literature, it's going to be very challenging to be able to say spinach is better than romaine or a melon is better than a chili pepper that's on that bush that you see here. So I think we have to really think through what decisions you're going to make about crop characteristics and potentially how to simplify that, right? So what if we don't know yet about crop characteristics? What if there isn't information in the literature? So obviously it's going to be okay, but think about how to simplify this question. So what do you do in the absence of the scientific data? So certainly you can make assumptions for better or worse, but we really want to lean on past experiences, lean on data from other similar locations or scenarios. Potentially some decision trees can help with that, and I'm going to show you one example. But ultimately, you're going to be having to make decisions that are likely going to be overprotective, right? So you're going to have to fall on what you believe to be the worst case scenario and kind of work your way back from that. Unfortunately, that's going to be potentially more cost investment there, but in the realm of public health, we always want to lean towards being overprotective rather than underprotective public health. When we think about water use practices, again, consider how water is being delivered to you. So that path for water to be provided to your farm or ranch, but also how it's being used. And so we talk a lot about your different water sources, if it's groundwater, if it's surface water, but how are you moving that water in and around your farm or ranch? What type of implements are additionally being used? And then how that's ultimately being applied to that harvestable portion of the crop. And I would say we can simplify this in a way of thinking about, again, if we don't have scientific knowledge related to crop characteristics, but we think about how water is being applied, ultimately it boils down to this question, right? Does water touch the harvestable portion of the crop, either always, sometimes, or never? And I think really trying to simplify that is going to help make this a little bit easier when you're trying to make determinations about reasonably likely foreseeable hazards and those risks associated with that, depending upon the crop that you're growing and how water is being applied to that crop. A little tongue in cheek, we really want you guys to take off those rose-colored glasses. Oftentimes we have folks that say, for this example, we're doing drip irrigation. There's no potential likelihood for that water to come into contact with that harvestable portion of the crop. But when you really get your boots in and on the ground and are really trying to assess how water is being used and what is happening for that water, we certainly see things like this. And so challenging each of you to get boots on the ground to do some of these assessments to really better understand how that water is being used and where these potential hazards or lack thereof might arise. Animal impact activities, of course, we've talked about this a little bit before, certainly thinking about how animals move in and around during your produce season, but also where they're moving in off season. And what Betsy mentioned about climate and seasonal impact potentially affecting water availability and motivating some of these animals to seek alternate water sources. So I think, again, you don't know these things unless you get boots on the ground or work with your team to have folks who are sentinels, boots on the ground, to be able to assess some of these areas. Environmental conditions, potentially this one's a little bit more straightforward. We're thinking about things we're already paying attention to. We mentioned rainfall, intensity, quantity, and duration is probably the one that folks think about the most, but also think about things that potentially could work in your favor, whether that's solar radiation, potentially changes or shifts in relative humidity, or even air temperature. And so I just pulled off, we have weather monitoring stations here locally owned by the University of Arizona. And I pulled off data the day before yesterday, just looking at precipitation, wind speed and direction, and air temperature. So certainly not saying that you have to do this every single day, but just acknowledging that this type of platform and this type of information is available should you need to pull out additional information to justify your action, specifically about weather and weather conditions. I think this is one of the biggest ones we have to think through is this adjacent land use or the use of biological soil amendments. And certainly, I think from a grower's perspective, they're really honed in and understand what they might be doing on their own property or how they're using these crops or soil amendments on their own land or in staging areas and where that is proximity to their water. But I think time and time again, we run into issues where it's usually your neighbors or it's usually someone who's not in produce that is upstream from you or adjacent to you that are potentially causing issues. So again, challenging you all to pay attention to, let's just say, compost staging areas or different types of application on adjacent land, and really trying to pay attention to what your neighbors are doing. So again, getting your boots on the ground out into the field to pay attention when you're conducting this type of assessment. So Laura or Faith is going to put these in the chat box, but I wanted to list out a current set of tools that are available. Obviously, FDA mentioned the Ag Water Assessment Builder. There's some additional LGMA resources that we're also going to provide. One of the nice things is that this Ag Water Assessment kind of mirrors or mimics what we've seen it conducted by the EPA for a number of different years, called a sanitary survey. And so although not all areas are applicable, there's a couple of areas that are appropriate and can make you think through some of the questions related to your water source and distribution system. The first is EPA sanitary survey for public water systems. The second is for recreational waters. And then here's the two additional assessment SOPs by the LGMA that we thought might be appropriate to share as resources. One's for weather assessment, and then the other is for a CAFO assessment. Hopefully those are in the chat. And just quickly to wrap up, here's the 8 areas of a sanitary survey. Most of these would be covered within an ag water assessment. The last one under operator compliance doesn't really directly apply, but it is important to think through what's your source, potentially if you're treating your water. What does your distribution system look like? How are you holding water? What about the components of that delivery system? So certainly all areas that could be appropriate to build up your resources and your written assessment as you move through. Here's an additional resource they're also going to share in the chat. This is the IFPA risk assessment scheme. Again, this is a flow-through diagram that lets you pick and choose either your water source, your delivery system, your application method, and helps you think through the potential low, medium, or high risk associated with them. So I'll end up here because I know we're running short on time, but here's some of the questions that we're currently getting. And again, challenging to think through. So how many assessments must a grower actually conduct? So I'll let you guys read through this, but this is a grower or consultant for a grower that grows multiple different types of commodities, has multiple irrigation districts, a couple hundred plus delivery sites. And really, this is super cumbersome. And what is that going to look like? So recommendations to this specific grower was thinking about when to lump different things and when to split. So lumping either like irrigation sources, like application methods, and like crop types. In those situations, potentially you'd be able to conduct an assessment for a variety of different areas as long as you felt that they were reasonably likely to be same or similar. When you want to split, again, makes sense. Either different irrigation sources, say we're using groundwater versus surface water. Say in another area, we're using drip versus overhead. That's going to look a little bit different. Or say you have a different crop type. So thinking about commodities like baby spinach is going to look a lot different than apples. And so again, trying to think through how to make this assessment work in your favor with not having to do hundreds of them for each individual location if you can, right? Certainly some pieces of this will be the same for all, and some pieces of this will be the different for all, but I think there's ways to work around that. So in summary, get your boots on the ground, get your team together, right? As Betsy said, if you get 5 different folks in the same room doing an assessment, you're going to get 5 different answers. But certainly having those conversations with your group and your team is going to help you in the end land upon defensible decisions. You've seen us do risk ranking before, and I think that's a helpful way to try to identify where to invest. And obviously communication is key. So really getting your group together and talking to those neighbors. So the activity that we're going to go through here in a second is really about taking those ag water assessments or those observations that you guys are going to be collecting and trying to bin them or bucket them into those different areas that we've talked about, right? Crop characteristics, ag water use practices, adjacent land use or biological soil amendments. And so ultimately, you're putting all of these observations in these different buckets. The questions that you're going to ultimately ask yourself are, do each of these buckets weigh the same? And where you're going to spend your time, money, and resources investing, right, to pay attention to those observations that you have in those specific buckets. And I would say, and certainly probably the rest of the folks on the call would probably agree with me, that they probably would identify some of these buckets being potentially more important or potentially more impactful ultimately on risk than others. And I think we don't want to lose sight of what that might look like as we're moving forward. I will go ahead and I will end there. I know I'm slightly over, but hopefully that was helpful.
Oh, you're perfect. That was super helpful. And you had a really nice graphic. All righty. Let's go ahead and try our game. Just as a reminder, we are going to introduce all of our panel. So we're also going to be joined by, we'll have our 3 speakers. We'll have Natalie, Sarah, and Coreen. We're going to do a little bit of quick reaction from the panel. Won't do all of them unless someone has anything that they just can't help themselves. And then we'll walk through these initial questions. What hazards do we see? Maybe what bucket they would fit into using FDA's listed factors, since that seems to be a guiding set of criteria for us to all start thinking about. Is there just other information that you might need? So let's go ahead and get into it. We'll do a few and we'll go from there and see how this works. All right. So we have our first one. This is a well for tree fruit. I believe it was avocado. So without giving too much away, let's do initial reaction. Maybe start with Channah. What do you think?
Certainly the first thing I would notice is that it doesn't look like it's protected, that there might be a gap around that casing that's there, and potentially there's direct access to that water from the surface.
Okay. Sarah, what are you thinking?
Yeah, the first thing that catches my eye is all that water sitting around that well. Where's that coming from? And could it have a potential impact?
Good. Anyone else on our panel before we start to get into some of the hazards?
I think about algae. It looks like there might be algae there, and that could potentially be an issue.
Yes. Same as everyone else.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we're starting to see some things initially. So if we were going to start to formulate these into our buckets, are we worried about everything? Do we have balls in every bucket?
I guess I'd want to know what crop, how is it being applied, where does that water go after we see the picture
All right.
there?
I got some more information for you. So I said it's avocados, 40-foot. It's used with microjet irrigation. They are doing some in-field fruit rinsing. It's tested monthly. Occasionally, it's got low E. coli counts, regular coliform counts. They're occasionally elevated, but they are shocking it annually. So there is your information that you have.
And they're rinsing harvested fruit with it?
based on their regulation.
So if they're using it for rinsing post-harvest, it's not going to meet the regulatory requirement if they have E. coli in it.
You shouldn't have to shock groundwater. Shouldn't be bacterial issue.
I think that the bigger issue is you're not actually dealing with what's causing the problem. What's causing the problem is you have an open well. And shocking it will take care of maybe the immediate concerns for a small length of time, but it's not going to address the root cause, shall we say. And yeah, you need to come up with protecting the well. And I would also say with the wet and the algae, if it's got enough algae growing there, this is a persistent problem, which is also leading to the persistent likely contamination.
And I would say the fact that it's such a shallow well, it's probably going to be impacted by other hydrologic events, so rain and things like that. So could explain why they often see little spikes in E. coli. So I agree.
Natalie, I like that line of thought because we hear a lot of times people, and sometimes even the way we present it, like when we teach, it's like groundwater is, we present it in a certain light. And when you really get into it, you know that not all groundwater is created equally. So what about that shallow depth makes you grab onto that initially, right? When you're thinking about risk.
Yeah. So for me, when the well is that shallow, and especially with it being open like this, rain events, runoff, there might actually even be like, I don't know where this area is. And if there's like some areas you've got aquifers and you can have some impacts there. So there's just a lot of things that could be going on that could impact the quality of that groundwater.
And Channah was saying, if your groundwater doesn't have connectivity to surface water or to, like clearly the casing's open in here, it's always nice to then say, okay, I still have these tests, right? And I've never gotten generic coli on them. But sometimes you get a fluke, right? Because you're taking a spigot or you're up at the field or something like that. But I think that's something really heavily for people to lean on. If they're like, oh, I don't know where my groundwater fits. That's really a nice thing because we're not hydrologists, right? And it's sometimes difficult to get in there.
Well, and even if that casing wasn't open, all of that water, it's leaking. If something can get out, something can get in.
And I think the thing is that, again, if you're using it for post-harvest, which I know this is a pre-harvest, so I don't want to necessarily go there, but if you're using it post-harvest, you can't use a surface water source for post-harvest handling. And we're calling this a well, but if the well is under the influence of surface water, which is what this is indicating with the algae, it's indicating that there's water there frequently, I would say, then it's no longer actually a groundwater source. It becomes a surface water source because it's under the influence of surface water. There's a whole lot going on here.
Yeah. And I will mention all these are real images and real descriptions. I did not make any of this up. So just reading it. Here's our next one. Lots going on here. Why don't we start with Natalie on this one? What is your initial thoughts?
My eyes are initially drawn to the darker soil in the back, which looks like there's cows. So is that a CAFO? Is that a dairy? And it looks like the topography could be that it's running.
Coreen.
The sprinkler on the left is something stopping it from blasting into the canal.
I would just say where the canal is, it's like there's a hill there, obviously. So runoff and what's at the top of that hill, and that's going to have an impact in that surface water too.
I would also say what's coming out of the sprinkler looks rather brown.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. You guys have identified, you said the dairy potentially there. You've got some spray. You're worried about runoff. So are we more or less concerned about this with what's going on with the weather, or are you bucketing? How are you bucketing your factors here, and what are you prioritizing?
I want to know what crop is this being used on and where? Because that I can't tell what that crop is. So do you have more information?
I do. So water source, it's a canal. It's a 92-mile long canal, not including the laterals. It irrigates a vast array of crops covered by the produce safety rule, including carrots, apples, blueberries, cherries, pears, onions, melons. This area is considered an arid climate with little rainfall during the production season. A grower pulling from the last 1/3 of the canal, so about 70, 92-mile post, noticed that the final water sample was showing a higher than normally coli count, about MPN, or most probable number, per 100 milliliter sample. But all of the other tests were extremely low, 5 to 10, maybe MPN per 100 mil water sample. They also evaluate their connections and distribution systems and immediate upstream activity for sites pulling from this canal, but they don't notice anything out of the ordinary so far. So how are we dealing with that? Where most of our water tests are looking pretty low, got a high one there.
So I guess it depends on the crop that it's going to go on, right? And the timing of the irrigation, like when are they going to, if this is you said an arid climate, the dust could certainly be a factor with the lack of humidity in the air. It's going to go further, but at the same time, you might have more solarization, irrigation before. Is there direct contact with the product or the edible portion of the harvest? So,
Betsy, you talked a lot about scientific literature, maybe some papers on die-off, potentially for some of those crops. Again, we'd have to go searching for them in this particular region, but might be a solution for them potentially if they had some science out there that talked about die-off over time for a specific crop.
I guess I would say if that's a poo sprinkler and you know your crop has been hit by a poo sprinkler, I'm not going to depend on die-off for that one. That's if it's not straight poo, then we're having a different discussion. But if it's straight poo that your crop is getting hit with, I would not be turning to the die-off literature.
If my field was many miles
down
upstream from this, I'm just pulling out of this canal. This is
sorry, you're pulling out of this canal. Okay, so if you're pulling out of this canal, then I'm sorry, I missed the question. But then I think you could look at die-off literature, and I think the thing that is really important is considering what you know about the canal. I would want to know something about the canal, certainly. I wouldn't just lean on die-off and say, I'm not going to test the canal and I'm not going to worry about it, especially if you know you have likely fecal contamination upstream. Even if the rule doesn't require me to do it, I still think it would be a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah. And I'll just add one thing about have a conversation with this landowner. When is this occurring? What kind of protections can they put in place? Does the sprinkler head move? Right? All of those things play a role in the potential for that to get into your water source.
I think also you have to think about wind and drift and likelihood of things happening. All of that plays a part. And to Laura's part about literature is what in the arid environments versus different environments. And again, there's some literature. I know there's the recent thing that's not quite published that you've been involved with, Channah, so I'll let you take that. But there's previous literature out of Nebraska with Elaine Berry and stuff looking at transport off of feedlots and how far it blew in the wind and looking at that movement of pathogens and generic.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with that research too, and I'm happy to share the links for those in our post-game wrap-up, as we'll call it. All
So
right.
it's an all bucket, right? What were all the buckets again?
Environment, crop
Crop
characteristics, ag water practices, other.
Yeah, it's in all of those, I think, right?
But a challenging one, right? So it's out there and you're doing this assessment, and again, you're probably going to see stuff, but then how are we translating that to risk, and then how are we prioritizing these things? So anyway, as we walk through this, but
And I say that a lot of times people don't even realize maybe some of the bigger ramifications. Like they're actually, that is manure. They separate out the solids and liquids. That is the traveling gun out there. That field they're actually applying it to is used for forage production. So that's going in for the dairy but they had no clue. All it took was a conversation to be like, hey, we get what you're doing, but maybe can you not do it so close to the canal? Because it really was just not even a thought that they had coming through. Sarah, I did see you come off of mute really quick. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in that it really poses that question of how far a distance we want to do that adjacent and nearby land use assessment. Because when Laura was talking about the scenario, she mentioned that the grower did a small assessment. I don't remember the specifications of exactly how far they went, but knowing that this is a 92-mile canal, how far do we expect a grower to go and assess? And it just really opens up a bunch of questions there, especially in that bucket in the assessment of adjacent and nearby land use.
Well, I think that'll tie into the whole concept of reasonably foreseeable and reasonably necessary, right? If the issue is 92 miles upstream, maybe it's not a reasonably necessary thing for you to do 92 miles upstream. So it just depends.
And I'll just play devil's advocate, right? So the grower might have thought that they were far enough away, but it wasn't until they did testing did they realize that there's a potential issue there.
Good conversation. Let's move to the next one.
Looks like there's lots of dust up ahead from some kind of activity. Maybe a porta potty next to the edge. And then this tank that's sucking up water, hopefully. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of porta potties I'm seeing. And yeah, what's going on in the distance?
Any other quick takes before I give you some more information? All right, let's learn a little bit about this situation. So this is the canal. We've got leafy greens, herbs, cane, and other mixed vegetables. Water in the region is managed by the Water Management District. Primary purpose of the canal system is to drain land to prevent flooding and manage saltwater intrusion. When not being used to drain water, its purpose is for seepage irrigation and occasionally for dust control on roads. It's used annually after chlorine treatment overhead for germination and watering and transplants. Rarely, only in drought conditions is it used after chlorine treatment for overhead or in drip lines. They do test it monthly for generic E. coli. Nothing is exceeding LGMA metrics, which is nothing is exceeding over 126 colony forming units per 100 mil sample. And we've had no samples in this canal test over the 256 mark. And we do have one piece of information here. We did get a salmonella positive in 100 mils in approximately 5% of tests. Not sure most people are testing for salmonella, but apparently they did. Channah, you know a lot about canals, feel like?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is how is this water being used, right? And so what you told us is most of the time that water is not going to be coming into contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. But you said potentially under drought conditions, or it sounded like germination potentially that could be used, right? And so that to me shifts that potential risk profile if we think that water was only sometimes almost never touching that harvestable portion of the crop. I think the things that worry me most about this is that are those porta potties washed out here? Are they cleaned here? Are they cleaned someplace else? Those types of things. And then I think if that water is being used for dust abatement, like we see in that truck, there's obviously potential for splash and transfer onto the crop, regardless of the intention of how the water's being applied. So things to think about.
Quickly go. They talk about water treatment, right? So, okay, we could treat our water. And I think Kruti's still with us, but there are different things, though, that you need to do to monitor water treatment.
I just want to jump in with the requirements for water quality treatment are that the water has to be delivered in a way that renders the treatment effective. It has to be appropriate for the intended purpose. The treatment has to meet the use of the label, and then it has to be effective.
Faith, any follow up to that?
Yeah, I think that where you already have people using water treatments for purposes that can be numerous beyond even food safety, I would say that then they have to look at, okay, how does the product I'm using or the device I'm using, what literature can I have in hand for the devices, especially for products? We have the labeling scheme through the EPA that is moving forward. So that will be really helpful information. But if you're using a device, it may be a little bit trickier, right? But you would actually want to have evidence in hand that the way that you're actually handling the water and treating it would result in an activation of those foodborne pathogens that you're targeting. And I think that for some people, that's going to be a really steep climb for those devices. But for a EPA registered pesticide product, we're going to have the label that we can reference, of course.
Perfect. All right. Maybe we will do one last one. Betsy, I don't think you've given me your initial thoughts first.
My initial thoughts are, it looks like the water's going out.
It is, but they are
So,
taking it from another place a little upstream.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, water's going out. Where's it going out from? And is somebody pulling the water back in to something else? And if that something else is produce, then there's a whole lot of other questions that go with this. And in terms of well, I'll stop there because we're not supposed to say too much. Sorry, I'll stop there.
Natalie, any initial thoughts before I give you some more information?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Betsy said. The other thing is just understanding adjacent land. That's a nice little forested area. It looks like a perfect place for like little deer to come and hang around and get in the water and do all the kinds of things that little deer do to create problems.
Okay, so this obviously a surface water source. It's located on a farm that backs up to a forest. There's two farms next to each other. The water that's coming out is actually coming from a potato packing house, one of their flumes. And they are also downstream using this to irrigate farmland that has date tomato. It's done by drip irrigation. And they did say they are running it through a sand filter since they understand that upstream, there's obviously some activity there. It's in the mid-Atlantic. For climate, they do test their water for E. coli counts. They've all been lower than 126 colony forming units per 100 milliliters, which is what their audits tell them they need to achieve. They're testing about 3 times a year. They do inspect their distribution system annually. They do use hunting for their control of wildlife. And when it was expressed, why was it brown? They said some folks came from DEQ, which is the Department of Environmental Quality, and told them that there was it's some tannins in the water. That's why they have a good filter.
Tannins in the water from what? From trees, from
I guess leaves and organic debris is what we were told. They did a test where they collected some water, left it for 24 hours, and this is what another agency, they said that it was, no, don't panic that it's brown. But I think these are very real things that people hear about their water, different agencies, different concerns.
Say from the side, you want to think about the whole thing, take that system thinking approach from our side, looking at the full system, walking through source to distribution to application and having that understanding of they inspect the distribution, they understand the drip application, taking that whole system into approach.
I think it is. This is exactly where I think we are hoping growers will go, right? One, it seemed turbid. They asked somebody why, what's causing it. I love that Natalie said, looks like a little deer would be happy here. And we find out they're controlling the little deer there are going to be little deer there. I think they're clearly paying attention, which is a big part of what we're trying to get growers to do. We're trying to get them to, as Sarah just said, I'm just building on what Sarah said, look at that holistic approach. And they've done, the fact that they know these things mean they've inquired about them, which is, I think, a very good sign.
Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds good, and then you see the picture and doesn't sound as good once you've seen the picture, but
Is it under plastic? Is the drip under plastic?
Yes, it is. Yeah, plastic mulch.
That changes the risk profile as long
Yeah,
as
It's good. Yeah, good. Yeah, sure.
Dramatically.
And I think Sarah did it nicely, right? You're looking at your source, you're looking at your distribution. Is it coming into contact with its harvestable portion? So it's definitely a systems-based approach. And I think you ladies did a wonderful job helping people. This is going to be a thought process. And we really got to prioritize things that are going to be a public health concern and not just check boxes. So with that, we will quit our game. For those of you who are still with us, we really appreciate it. Want to thank the panel. There is an evaluation for you to do, and there's a couple different questions because I'm curious moving forward into quote unquote our season 4. What do we want to know more about? Do we want to go through all the different science with these bucketed factors or other ones? Do you want to know what Contact's doing on the research side? So do you want to see some of Channah's water treatment data and some of those models? So if you have a chance, give us a shout. It's all anonymous. So thank you. And thanks to my panel again. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you back in the fall.